From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, December 12. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese pledged $8.5 million to fund the redevelopment of Sydney's Jewish Museum after a second anti-Semitic attack was carried out in the city's east on Tuesday night. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns blasted suggestions the Woollahra incident didn't amount to anti-Semitism.
This is not simply just an act of vandalism on the streets of Sydney. We need to call it out for what it is. It is anti-Semitic and it needs to be met with a full response from New South Wales Police and the New South Wales Government.
Meanwhile, leaders of Melbourne's Jewish community have called on governments at all levels to address the surge in anti-Semitic incidents after a synagogue was firebombed and a local member's electorate office was vandalised. All our reporting and analysis of this ongoing issue is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. It's been days of chaos for the government, but that didn't stop the PM from spruiking Labor's big childcare plans on Wednesday. So is it a sweet enough deal to get voters back on board before the next election? That's today's episode. It was an announcement befitting an election campaign.
There are more than 1 million reasons to invest in early education, some of whom are here with us here today, one of them riding a dinosaur down there.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, surrounded by a crowd of early childhood educators, parents and cute toddlers and babies, unveiled the Labor Party's plan to overhaul the childcare sector.
Today I announce that our government is establishing a $1 billion Building Early Education Fund. This is the single biggest investment by an Australian government ever in new childcare services.
It came at a crucial moment for the government. The PM has been under pressure for days to take more decisive action on rising anti-Semitism.
The fact is, there's never going to be the perfect day. This is how I think Albanese looked at this.
Sarah Eisen is a political reporter with The Australian.
So I think he was very clear that this was the week he was going to do it. I also think he wanted to do it because they're also cognizant of the coalition's nuclear energy costings, because they want that day where the coalition release their nuclear energy costing, which is any day now, free for Labor to attack and criticise that. It feels very much like an election, and we're very close to one. It could be within a couple months at the earliest. It could be by May.
The PM pledged on Wednesday to scrap an activity test that requires parents and carers to work or study if they want to access childcare benefits. Labor will also give families earning a combined annual income of less than $530,000 access to 3 days per week of government-subsidised childcare if it wins the next election. And the government says it'll build more than 150 childcare centres in cities and regions where they're needed most, as well as drawing thousands of new workers into the sector, with taxpayers footing the bill.
Now, the coming budget update will show Commonwealth funding for childcare subsidies is increasing by $3.1 billion over the next 4 years to support an extra 200,000 children to receive early education. Alongside this, 34,000 more early educators have joined the workforce. 34,000. There are another 125,000 in training, including in free TAFE right across the nation.
Now, bear with me here while we do a bit of maths. Modelling released by the Productivity Commission in September, that's the government's independent research and advisory body, suggested the cost of ditching the current activity test for 5 days a week would cost about $2 billion a year. On top of that, removal of the activity test could threaten productivity if parents and carers are no longer paying income tax. So how is Labor getting away with it so cheaply?
The government's saying that the Productivity Commission's costings and their costings are very different. They're saying the Productivity Commission's using data from 2019, 2020, and they're using much more up-to-date data. They're not saying it's a huge difference in policy or that we've managed to do it cheaply for this reason. They're looking at it as a calculation difference rather than a substantive policy difference.
Is there a world in which this isn't about money or politics at all? Like, is this just the right thing to do for Australian families and for Australian kids from an education perspective?
If we zoom out back past the Middle East conflict, back before we were around the corner from an election, the call for particularly the activity test to be scrapped has been going on literally for years, for so many years. And the government's own Women Economic Equality Task Force, not the last budget, but the budget before that, recommended the activity test be scrapped. So outside of the money, outside of the election cycle, outside of everything political, this is a long time coming for Labor, particularly for a government that sees universal childcare as the end game. For that to be achieved, you need to be taking these incremental steps regarding the activity test as a starting point, addressing the childcare desert, looking at boosting wages for workforce and so on. So this is a critical piece of the puzzle that is regarding Labor's long-term vision beyond the typical day-to-day politics and the desire to get some really good stuff out before an election.
Labor made moves in the childcare space back in August.
Australia's 200,000 childcare workers will receive a 15% pay rise funded by federal taxpayers. Amid concerns it risks further fuelling inflation, the Prime Minister says the wage increase is conditional on childcare fees being capped.
At the time, opposition leader Peter Dutton criticised the move as a one-off sugar hit.
The government has to explain whether or not these workers are going to get this pay ongoing or whether they will get a pay cut after the election.
The sector, a lot of people, the parenthood, non-for-profit sector, a lot of those sorts of bodies have called for the opposition to match what Labor's announced. The opposition isn't going to do that. The opposition is saying that the activity test already has exemptions you can apply for if you're from a disadvantaged background. It's also saying that it's going to unnecessarily and unsustainably fuel demand, which is not at all okay in a cost of living crisis. So they're talking about a smoke and mirrors moment, a moment that isn't actually going to help Australian families.
Coming up, what Labor can learn about childcare from our friends across the Pacific. When Anthony Albanese unveiled the government's multi-billion-dollar childcare scheme on Wednesday, he likened it to another Labor Party invention.
Friends, a Labor government created universal Medicare because we believe that every Australian has the right to quality, affordable health care.
That was in 1984, and former Prime Minister Bob Hawke played a starring role in the marketing material for the scheme.
That every Australian, from newborn babe to Prime Minister, can share in the cheapest, simplest and fairest health insurance scheme Australia's ever had.
Now, Albo's gunning for the same success with early childhood education.
And that's why we want to build a universal childcare system. Simple, affordable and accessible for every family.
There are lessons to be learned, not from Medicare, but from Canada, where a nationwide early learning and childcare plan was introduced in 2021. That scheme pumped more than $30 billion of federal funds into the system in a bid to make childcare available to all families for an average of $10 per day.
If you're a parent, you deserve affordable childcare. You need affordable early learning and childcare. That's why a re-elected Liberal government will continue to support Canadian families by fighting for $10 a day childcare right across the country.
The thinking was, from an economic perspective, that the Canadian government would break even. Childcare that's flexible, affordable and accessible enables parents to rejoin or contribute more to the workforce and boost productivity. But 3 years on, the scheme is on shaky ground, with most provinces struggling to meet their targets for new daycare spaces by the 2026 deadline. Financial pressures have caused some centres to close or pull out of the scheme, sending fees in the opposite direction. Childcare workers and early childhood educators are leaving the sector in droves, with many saying they're underpaid and underappreciated. And waiting lists have blown out all over the country, meaning kids from low-income and poor families could miss out altogether. So, could the same thing happen in Australia? Here's Sarah Eisen.
Labor's feeling confident, particularly because they have a plan in place regarding workforce that rests quite heavily on two things, which is wage rises that have been pumping through for some time now, the Good Start early learning wage rise of 10% just this month, and also migration settings, plenty of really clear migration pathways for people to work in the sector. So while demand might be really high, they're hopeful that by investing directly and even owning centres, coupled with getting people to actually work in the industry, will mean that they can meet this demand. It's ambitious, it's a gamble. Is it a risk? Absolutely. But it's one that Labor reckons it can figure out.
Anthony Albanese said on Wednesday that Labor's pledge to make childcare cheaper was the single biggest policy commitment the party made in the run-up to the last election.
In our first term, we've brought down the cost of childcare for over 1 million families. And we're boosting the wages of up to 200,000 early educators by that 15%.
Labor's popularity has plummeted in recent months as voters struggle under a cost of living crisis. So the question now becomes, will it win votes when Australians go to the polls in 2025?
Look, I think it might be a big part of where some young families put their vote, only because the coalition doesn't currently have an alternative vision in that particular space. And now this isn't just about the latest announcement we've got this week. This is also about the nearly $5 billion pumped in the first budget that gave families up to 90% of a subsidy for those on the really low income spectrum, $80,000 or less. And it covered families up to $530,000 for a household income. So Labor's saying this is everything we're doing for mums and dads, and we are the ones who've got a vision for you. I think that's compelling. However, at the same time, even though Labor's put in all of these different things, the costs of childcare has been going up. It's been eating away at all the benefits Labor's delivered. So people aren't really feeling this in their back pocket, so it might not be that convincing an argument either. It's really up to what is going on family to family, but I don't think it won't sway anyone. I think there's a chance of getting a few votes. The question is how many.
Sarah Eisen is a political reporter with The Australian. You can read that story, as well as all the nation's best news, sport and politics right now at theaustralian.com.au.